Washington State launched its Domestic Extremism and Mass Violence Task Force last November. They recently came out with their preliminary report, and I've been geeking out on this topic with my friend TJ Martinell, who is a journalist for the Center Square, since it was legislation, which actually didn't even get passed. They snuck this in through the budget. Today, we are going to discuss what's in the preliminary report and what you need to know and where we think this all could be headed. TJ, I am so honored that you agreed to join me today to have this discussion about Washington's Domestic Extremism and Mass Violence Task Force. You and I have been kind of in the rabbit hole together, I would say, for a few years now on some of these weird dystopian type policies that have been happening in Washington State. And I will say you are my favorite journalist because you really get in there, you get the facts, and I'm impressed that you are able to present the facts with minimal and maybe I pick it up because I kind of know, but you really just have a way of presenting the facts without having a bias one way or the other. TJ is a journalist for the Center Square. I'm going to have that linked in the description of this video so that you can follow his work. He's also on X, which I will have that linked below. Go give him a follow. But today we're going to dig into specifically the Washington State Domestic Extremism Task Force. TJ's been watching this really close. I've put out a lot of content on this. This started as House Bill 1333 in 2023. And TJ, I think you and I tracked it pretty closely, and then it never passed, and then it got snuck into the budget.
Which is a very convenient way to get stuff in without the lawmakers actually looking at what's going on.
You know, the Democrats are really effective at finding these little backdoor loopholes to sneak in what I'll say is controversial policies that they don't, that they kind of want to fly under the radar. So based on what you've been seeing, because I know you've been tracking their meetings since they started in November 2024 was the first meeting. And I know you've been watching. What do you feel like this task force has actually been what was called for in House Bill 1333, or is it a pared down version of what that bill was calling for?
You know, I think the issue with that is if it is what they were calling for, that's not a good thing necessarily. It's been a while since I looked at the original bill. I just know that you look at the people on the board. I think there's numerous issues that we could look at. I mean, they call it a domestic violent extremism and mass violence task force. So my immediate discernment of that is they're conflating domestic violent extremism with mass violence that could have nothing to do with politics. So if there's gang style violence going on in Seattle, that's mass violence, that's getting basically thrown into the same pot as, say, a terrorist attack. And then on top of that, if somebody has what's considered to be extreme views, they get lumped in with gang violence and terrorism. So I just find that interesting that the term domestic violent extremism, which makes you think of domestic violence, right? Domestic violence. And then they use the term violent extremism. Which they still have yet to come up with a definition of. I think that was.
Is it violent extreme? I mean, being violent is an extreme behavior.
Wait, that's a whole separate discussion. But I mean, the violence in and of itself is, in my opinion, is not. It's amoral. It depends on the context. If somebody's breaking into my home and I violently remove them, that's violence, but it's justified. If a country's attacked and they defend themselves, that's violence, but I would argue, would be justifiable. I think the issue is that domestic violent extremism, what they're trying to do, and I don't think this is my personal opinion, not as an individual. I think that they are going to struggle to come up with a definition that includes illegal and legal activity. Because there's so many constitutional issues with labeling certain ideologies, beliefs, peoples, groups as domestic violent extremists by a government. This isn't the Anti-Defamation League. This is not the SPLC. This is not a private organization. This is a government entity trying to say these people, we are classifying their speech, their activities, and their organizations and their beliefs in a separate category as other people that we whose speech we agree with. That's
Right.
it's going to create so many problems because imagine if somebody applies for a permit to have a rally at a park and that permit's denied and the government has labeled them to be DVEs, right?
Right.
So that's I what's interesting also is if you look at the members of this task force, you see people being represented on one side of the equation, but not the other. For example, there's a group that provides funding for legal defense of illegal or immigrants who break the law, right?
Right.
There's and then there's the different groups, but you don't see the other side of like, you have people representing immigrants. You don't have anybody calling for stronger border security or for reduction on immigration or anything like that. Now, people are going to say, well, that's an extreme view. Well, the question is who gets to define extremism and why that's not the role of the government. One would argue, yeah, as an American who believes in the First Amendment, it's not the government's job to decide what extremism is. Their only job is to enforce laws and protect rights.
Yeah, I want to kind of go into the makeup of who's on the task force, because that's very interesting, and I think people really need to understand who the members of the task force are.
Yeah.
From what I've gathered, there's only one that seems to be sort of what I guess I'll say right leaning, and that is the sheriff from Walla Walla. I forget his name off the top of my
Right.
head. And I've seen him a couple of different times bring up, the First Amendment and a lot of the constitutionality of questioning the constitutionality of some of the things that this task force is trying to do. You mentioned the illegal immigration group protecting, the sanctuary state policies of Washington. Who are some of the other members on this task force? And would you say that, you know, it's all been pretty much stacked towards
Yeah,
one side?
I mean, yeah, this is the issue is that for example, there's what's called Utopia Washington, which is a queer and trans people of color led organization. And that stands for United Territories of Pacific Islanders Alliance Washington. So I don't know how many trans and queer Pacific Islanders there are in Washington State, but I don't, I imagine there's not a lot of them. And there's not I mean, such a small group of people, but they're having a voice on this task force. Or there's there's like we mentioned the Washington Immigrant Defense Network. There's the Western State Center, which has come out against President Trump's executive orders regarding our border and the number of illegal aliens that have come into the country in the last 5 years. They said that him calling it an invasion is false and bigoted. And then you have the Peace and Justice Action League, which among its priorities last year was ending mass incarceration and systemic racism in our city county carceral systems and countering white nationalism. So what's interesting is in Bob Ferguson, when he was the Attorney General for the state, he published that report on domestic violent extremism. White nationalism was part of his definition. So he had a working definition of what it meant. So I think that's the issue, is that he can put that out in a study or a report, but they have to come up with a working definition for how to treat this from a public health perspective, which I don't know to what extent they could combine that with that recent public health bill that they passed that has basically the state imposing policies down on the county. I think that story, that bill most people were thinking about the vaccine mandates or something like that.
Right, right.
But I could see them trying to use that as part of a public health, because they're looking at this from a public health perspective.
Right.
how do you treat, so they're effectively saying certain ideologies and beliefs are an infectious disease, is what they're basically arguing, which again, that runs into some constitutional issues. But there's no group on this, there's no countering group for a lot of these organizations. You're not seeing the Family Policy Institute, I think it is, of Washington State. You don't see focus on the family here. You don't see someone from the Heritage Foundation or from any what you would describe as a right wing. The only, what one could argue, the only right wing, quote unquote, people are going to be from the law enforcement community,
Right.
are concerned with constitutional issues, because I think their concern is probably going to be, we're going to be expected to enforce any laws that might come as a result of this, or any policies, and we don't want to get sued or run afoul of the Constitution. So
Yeah, I think so. You touched on that about the public health aspect of this task force, and I don't remember that being part of the original report that came out of Ferguson's office in, I think it was January of 2023. And I don't remember it being in House Bill 1333. But since this task force began meeting, they have been classifying this domestic extremism as a public health issue, which
right,
is why, like you and I were talking, we were messaging about. My question to you was, could this, since they're classifying this domestic extremism as a public health matter, could they somehow twist that House Bill 1531, which gives the state really unprecedented authority over public health matters? Could that be twisted? Like, vaccine mandate is kind of the first thing that comes
right.
to everybody's mind. But when you start sort of, you know, thinking outside of the box and how, they could twist these laws, you know, is that a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tend to try to look at things from a holistic perspective, because nothing that the nothing that's done in Washington State is done by itself, or
Right.
isolated. So you've got the public health bill, you've got the domestic violent extremism task force that treats things from a public health perspective. You also now have the hate bias incident hotline that people can report on, and then you now have an updated hate crime bill where
Right.
things can be treated in part or the whole. I could envision where if someone is threatened with prosecution for a hate crime or for perceived bias, they can say, you can do that, or we can go to trial, or you agree to go through this public health process where we basically try to treat you as if you have a disease. And it was interesting. There was the I cannot recall his name, but the mayor of Leavenworth back during 2020, after the George Floyd incident, he put out a press release. I don't know if it's still out there, but he described racism as a disease for which there was no cure. So even back then, you had discussions about treating certain sociological stuff from a public health perspective. And of course, he was referencing that to the whole COVID, because we were in the middle of lockdowns at the time.
Right.
I mean, you're seeing that kind of going on where they're going to start because it allows you to go after beliefs you don't agree with from a, we're trying to, like, we're concerned about people's health, right? It's almost like it's the instead of Big Brother, we have the mother-in-law. Right?
Right. So do you see the treatment for this disease would be like trainings?
I could see it being some form of a struggle session where they sit down and they try to have, and they'll probably have activists. I mean, this is all speculation, but I'm just putting on my thinking hat and saying, what would I do in their position? You have activists who are being paid and funded by local entities, and they use public health terms like a social health specialist or something like that, right? But they're just an activist. They sit down with somebody who's trying to avoid a jail term, and they basically just try to convince them that, you know, to change their mind, and also potentially rat out anybody, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
That that's where we see that a lot, where people get called out, and there's a massive social pressure, and part of their cleansing or healing is ratting out people in their organizations or revealing secrets or anything that can be used by the state. These are all possibilities that people just need to be prepared for. And what's interesting in the task force report is they don't mention any definition, like I said, but they do give definitions from other organizations. One of the ones I found really interesting is, so there was the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland, and it talks about far-right extremism, and their definition are people who fit the following: they're fiercely nationalistic, they're suspicious of centralized federal and state authority, which is ironic because we just had the No Kings rally
Right.
over that. Reverent of individual liberty, again, No Kings rally. The belief that one's personal or national way of life is under attack. You're having a task force look at your beliefs and saying it's extreme. I mean, yeah. Let's see. Yeah, so it's just these weird these they're taking certain beliefs and saying and almost proving the point that these groups would argue. Like, you know, but I just, like I said, I thought it was ironic that we just had this No Kings rally, which is opposed to centralized authority within the executive branch, and yet and this is one of their problems is with coming up with these definitions. These definitions, what they consider extreme, changes based on who's in power. So,
Right.
for people who don't know, I've been with the 10th Amendment Center as a contributor and writer, researcher, blogger for over 10 years. And when President Trump was first elected, suddenly people who were never talking about decentralized authority or states' rights or nullification or anti-commandeering suddenly started talking about it. I mean, you have state officials talking about the founders' opposition to a permanent standing military in amicus briefs now, stuff that you would have never heard about like 10
Right.
years. So I think that that's going to be one of their struggles. Is extremism is all in so many cases is who's in control, who's in power. Because if they're in control, they're not going to be opposed to centralized authority within the federal government. And I didn't hear any conversations about that during the Biden administration.
Right.
So I think that that's where they're gonna. It's I wonder if it's really gonna be they're gonna be able to come up with anything meaningful, or if it's gonna just be this report with these recommendations and the state legislature just doesn't do anything with it. Um, or they come up with a definition that's so vague it can mean whatever they want to mean, because this is where within Washington State, here's the thing: they're always going to the people writing this are writing from a position of power, and power that's not going to go away anytime soon. So
Right.
that's where they're going to have an advantage. They can create a definition that is very specific to Washington State. So they can, instead of saying fearful of centralized authority within the federal government, they can just talk about the state. Say fearful of state authority, because it's always the authority is going to be in the hands of these people for the foreseeable future, barring
Yeah.
some really completely unpredictable black swan event.
Now, Governor Ferguson was asked a couple weeks ago about, was something extremist behavior, and he answered and said, "Well, I don't have a definition for that." And then it was shortly after that question he was asked by a reporter that this report came out that also doesn't have a definition. So you've kind of touched on why you think that is.
Yeah.
Do you think that by the time this task force is, and I forget what the date is for them to give their recommendations to the legislature, I imagine they're going to have some kind of recommendations for the 2026 session.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate they're going to come up with anything? Because I've watched enough of these meetings and it really seems like kind of like this radical left therapy session where they all just like to, bring their grievances and hear each other talk and, kind of complain about different issues, but they don't seem to be coming up with any policies or solutions.
I think calling it a therapy session is, I think, probably the most accurate. and I've been witnessing this and watching this and observing this since Trump was first elected in Washington State, is there's very much this sense of, I would say when someone is internally unstable, they try to control things around them.
Yeah.
And so I think with Washington, people in Washington State, they are trying to control Washington State as much as possible in terms of what in terms of just wanting to, they can't control Washington DC, so they want to control Washington State, and they want to feel a sense of control over the situation. And so they can't impose policies at a national level, so they're going to try and impose policies at a state level. But I think part of it is just them having this a sense of emotional comfort of like, you know, it's really hard to describe, but it's very psychological in nature, and it's impossible to logically. Uh, it's not logical. I mean, it was like when Seattle wanted to Trump-proof Seattle by imposing a local income tax, like that. Imposing a local income tax is not going to affect Donald Trump in DC, but
Right.
this is them. It's them trying. You'd have to almost sit down and talk to some of these people and understand what's going on as far as where they're at. But I think, and we were talking about this before the recording started, but I think part of it is it's people detaching from reality and having reality break that psychosis of what they think is actually going on in the world. I think part of it also is you have this issue of, and this is kind of fascinating to watch and observe as well, is when someone has a victim mindset, they have to be the victim even when they're in control. And so you have people who have power, but are acting like they are being oppressed. Um, there's the saying that they cry out in pain as they lash out at you type saying of where you have these people you have people on this task force in frankly our state government as well, people who are sitting there and talking as if they are not in charge, and yet they are the ones holding power and control and imposing policies while pretending like they're having things done to them against their will. Um, I think that
Yeah.
that's one of the things that's very fascinating about Washington state politics is it's a game of who's the biggest victim, and they are the one at the top of the power structure, and yet it leads to this weird cognitive dissonance of acting like a victim while you're dictating to other people. Right? So
That's a really good, that's actually a really good way to put it. And you're 100% correct. And it's almost like, and even, over these past few years, while Biden was in the White House, they kind of, I would say, were acting like Trump was still somehow,
he was still in charge.
an authority over them. And they had to do all these things because they were a victim of, conservatives or Republicans or Trump or whoever. And so that's why they have to make all these um, weird policies to protect themselves from these tyrants.
Right. I mean, we see this kind of, and there's, of course, there's any extremism discussion in Washington State has to involve abortion.
Yeah.
The way that people will talk, you would think that if some guy who's to the left of Lenin, or sorry, to the right of Lenin, gets in charge in any way, shape, or form, that abortion is going to be banned tomorrow. That's another example of where people, where it's basically enshrined, it's not enshrined in our Constitution, unlike the right to keep and bear arms as an individual. Abortion is not enshrined in our Constitution, but it's the idea that it could be banned under any scenario, barring some mass migration of people from Idaho, Oklahoma, and Texas, it's not going anywhere. But yet, that the fear of that going away is a very powerful rhetorical weapon in any political campaign, in at least in Western Washington, and that's probably going to be part of the discussion on the extremism task force. But yeah, I think that going back to what you're saying, the therapy session thing is probably a good way of describing it, which is why it's gonna be them wanting to go away from this saying, "Everything's gonna be okay, nothing bad's gonna happen to us, the right people are in charge," or something like that, and so, and go yeah,
It makes for good messaging for them because they're able to, to people who aren't paying attention to politics and aren't, really like going down rabbit holes like people like you and I are, to the average person who is just maybe scrolling through Instagram or whatever.
Right.
they're going to catch, a clip of, one of these people doing this whole victim dance, and they're going to process that as, oh my gosh, we have to protect abortion. We have to protect trans rights. We have to, because
Yeah.
these people are in, threat.
Well, and it goes back to the title, mass violence and domestic violent extremism. That means that they can conflate the two in a way where they're not saying something inaccurate, but where they know and a person's going to misunderstand what they're saying. So they can, let's say there's a ton of gang violence in Seattle. They can say, they can try to tie any of that. Or let's say that there's one person who's, the whole transgender thing. If there's violence within that community, they can claim that that was anti-trans
Mhm.
violence, and that these people who are spouting these ideologies are responsible for that violence, right? This is where they tie speech into violence by saying this person who says this, it leads to violence. And so they can, because I was looking at the report and they talk about the mass violence or mass shootings or mass killings, and the problem is the violence is being caused by different things. You have gang violence or you have drug trafficking related violence. That's completely different from political extremism. And the other thing that was interesting is they were giving examples of domestic violent extremism in Washington State, and they go back to 100 years ago when the KKK were having rallies. There was violence against the Chinese in various cities. Then they compare. They don't compare, but in the next sentences they talk about I think there was 6 Seattle police officers off duty who attended the Stop the Steal rally on January 6th, and this is why I say that they're going to
Mhm.
report what they could say is intentionally inaccurate. They described it as a deadly insurrection. Well, the only person killed there was Ashley Babbitt, whose family just settled $6 million for, they didn't claim any wrongdoing for the federal government, which they rarely do in this case, but they settled $6 million over her death. The cops weren't charged, nor was anybody else, with inciting or engaging in insurrection. And I've always had a huge problem with the use of the word insurrection, and that this idea that they were on the verge of overthrowing the government. I'm sorry, I will not take anybody seriously who says that. They disrupted a formal ceremony to certify the election. That was not the inauguration ceremony. They weren't trying to kill Biden as he was
Right.
taking his oath of office. And I've asked people, what exactly they disrupted the ceremony. Was the army going to turn themselves over to the guy with the bison horns on his head? Were they going, or the guy was holding the lantern? Was the army gonna just submit to them? And Trump was president the next day. So like what exactly I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Beckett, about Thomas Beckett. There's a
Mhm.
scene in the movie where Henry II gives him the seal of England, which has 3 lines on it, and he goes, "Don't lose it. If there's no more seal, there's no more England, and we're gonna have to pack it up and go back to Normandy." That's literally what they thought, that if they disrupted the ceremony, that somehow the government was gonna get handed over to Trump, even though he was still president. So this kind of goes to like what extremism. My thought is calling that an insurrection other than a violent riot or violent protest, uh, a violent disruption of a formal ceremony. I would consider that to be extreme, extremism. So it's a question of who's calling the shots here, on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, kind of off off on a tangent here, but I think it's relevant to your point about them calling it an insurrection. I just watched this series on Apple TV with Jennifer Aniston and Reese Witherspoon. It's called The Morning Show, and it's
Yeah.
it's a terrible leftist series. So I was mostly just curious, so I kept watching it. But in the last few episodes, Reese Witherspoon's brother, she's from a small town, gets a job in New York on this TV show, and her brother is a conservative, and he's at the J6 insurrection, and so they do a series of episodes where this storyline is intertwined in the episodes. And as I was watching it, just thinking about like your average, middle-aged woman like myself,
Right.
who's not engaged in politics, and just hearing, like your A-list actresses, Witherspoon and Aniston, talking about this insurrection and how, her brother was a domestic terrorist and all these things. It's like, if you didn't know better, you would be just kind of eating up that line. And it's just
It's
such
actually
a
kind of scary. I've watched,
very scary.
I don't have cable. I've never had cable, so I don't watch the ironically, I'm in media, but I don't watch the news. But I was at, a friend's house recently where the news was on, and I know enough information behind, like, as part of my own work as a reporter, the coverage was so slanted and left out so many important details. I was like, this is a separate reality. And if you just internalize what the TV tells you, yeah, it's scary to think that they could come out with a report saying there's all this domestic violent extremism that's going on in Washington State, and they're being ga- um, motivated by what Trump's doing. I mean, you could easily see there being retaliation of some kind, and I don't know how, but I think that this is part of where the public health thing comes into play, where
Yeah.
they, I, when they could say domestic extremism is a public health threat, and we remember all the rhetoric from the COVID lockdowns, where if it saves one life, you're putting people's health at risk. So that's where I could see them condoning. Well, one, I part of the problem is I could see it condoning violence against people labeled domestic extremists.
Mhm.
You know, these people were putting. We don't condone violence, but they were putting people's public health at risk. Um, so I there's a lot of possibilities. It's a question of, I think what it always comes down to is what are they going to be able to do or say that's going to cause the average person to to just accept it and not cause this disruption in their way of thinking, or where it cause them to say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. As long as they're able to use the right rhetoric.
Well, especially if they're going to put people through struggle sessions or some kind of, punishment or, training or something to get them to treat them for this, disease of domestic extremism. That's going to put fear in other people. Well, I don't want that to happen to me, and so I'll just fall in line. I
Or
think you're going to see a lot more sheep.
yeah, I think also you can have it where, I mean, God forbid that there's an organization that's paid to, that has people paid to basically report bias incidents. So people are engaging in political activism, they're expressing protected speech, and somebody's reporting them on the hotline, and that person, it's it's almost where it's this weird extrajudicial, extra legal form of the East Stasi. And I don't, for people who may
Mhm.
not know, I think it was one out of every three East German citizens was an informant for the Stasi. This was discovered after the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union fell, and they had access to all the records. And there's like, it was a third of the population was spying on other people. There was a film that came out by Disney in 1980, which they'll never remake because it's anti-communist, but it's about this family that fled in a balloon over the East German wall to go to West Germany. And one of the guys who left was being asked why he decided to go to West Germany. One of the reasons was, he said, I could not have a conversation under any circumstances, even in the privacy of my own home, without wondering if somebody next to me was an informant. That's how bad it was. So, like, imagine where, now you have family members at Thanksgiving or whatever, and they're saying things that you might not agree with, and it leads to arguments or bad feelings. Well, what happens when that person then goes and reports them to this hotline? And then it gets tied into, they have a record of that. Then you've got, there's an incident that occurs where they could be potentially charged with a hate crime. Because again, a the hate crime definition now is in part or the whole. So if you're in
Right.
an argument with somebody and you say something that's considered racist, sexist, xenophobic, whatever list it is, and then you engage in what could be argued justified violence because it's self-defense, right? Somebody attacks, whatever. They can say, well, you were justified in the violence if you hadn't said this. And that shows that it was committed, not in the whole, your violence was not on the whole justified, because part of it was bias in response. So we're going to potentially charge you, and we also, they'll say we've got records of people reporting you for violence incidents and all that kind of stuff. This is just where, if they were to actually do this kind of stuff, this is what it could lead up to. On top of that, I don't know if people know, but the gun stores now have required audio recordings. So if you go to a gun store, imagine you go out and buy a gun and you say a bunch of stuff, like you're just talking politics, and then you are being investigated for a potential hate crime, and you're able to go get a recording of what you said at the gun store. And you didn't say anything illegal, but it could be used to say, you said this here, like let's say a guy's complaining about immigration or whatever, and then he gets into a fight with an illegal alien over something. They can say, you attacked him because of your bias, and we have recordings of you saying anti-immigrant things from this gun store where you bought a gun or you bought anything. I mean, this is how this spider web of stuff. And then they say, well, you want a public health treatment program. And basically the threat, I mean, this is kind of out of 1984, where they try to just break someone or make someone realize like your whole life will be destroyed, or you can cooperate and we won't take all this stuff. I for a lot of people, ostracization is a huge motivating factor in what causes them to basically do a complete about turn on stuff, because they adopt the beliefs that will cause them to stay within the group. And it's understandable because it's part of our nature. We don't, if you're part, back in the day when you're part of a tribe, being kicked out of the tribe was, more or less a death sentence for the most part.
I'm glad you brought up the FFL, the gun bill, that FFLs are now required to have these audio recordings, and how, like, that's the whole deal with legislation, is it is a web, and each bill doesn't stand on its own, and you've effectively connected the hate crime hotline bill, the 13th, the domestic extremism, and the FFL. And I'm going to throw one more in there. I don't know the bill number. Maybe you do. It passed this year. It passed with bipartisan support, and it is to put a device on vehicles for people who have been caught, with high speed tickets or things like that. I'm not sure exactly what the threshold is. And one of the ways that I look at legislation like this is, like, it starts out as one thing and then it slowly or quickly inches to being something else, but it's part of that whole surveillance state.
It's this, they never come at it directly. It's like with the capital gains income tax. This is another thing for which I'm not willing to ever have a discussion with anybody. It is a tax on income, but they called it an excise tax. And the Supreme Court wrote in their opinion, our tax code is inequitable and this is legal. I mean, that's literally what they did. So after how many times they tried to get it passed by voters, it got struck down. They tried to pass it through all these different ways as an income tax, and they got struck down. Well, then they just called it an excise tax and they got it in through the back door. This is the tactic that's used. Or for example, this is kind of unrelated, but just gives you an idea. To withdraw money from the budget stabilization account, also known as the rainy day fund, you need, I believe, a 2/3 majority of the legislature to do that. What they do is they just divert the money before it's put in the account. And that's how money that's intended to go into the stabilization account gets diverted. And that got challenged and it got upheld. The court said, yeah.
Wow.
I mean, this is, every time you think you've got them pinned on something as far as law is concerned, they find a way to get around it. And in the case of the income tax, they just used word magic. They just called it something else.
Yeah.
So this is where they are not going to directly do things. It's kind of like there was a saying in the Army back during World War II: we can't make you do anything. We can just make you regret not doing it. And so they'll say, okay, we're not. It's like with another example. We have I think one of the most specific and explicit individual rights to keep and bear arms enshrined in our Constitution. There is no ambiguity. There's no mention of, it does mention militia, but in a saying, it actually doesn't mention militia specifically, but says this doesn't mean you get to have a body of armed men, but you have a right to bear arms as an individual in defense of yourself. We still have, like, they just passed a permit to buy on this stuff. So this goes to show how these things can occur where they don't come directly after something. They come around it. So that's where people need to be, I think, concerned with, if your beliefs, your protected speech, your protected ideology, things are protected by the First Amendment as an American. If your views fall outside of the mainstream as set by the people running the state, you should be concerned about what's going on, because if you've got relatives who are politically active on the other side of the spectrum, that could become a liability. I mean, this is where
Yeah.
we could easily see the breakdown in human interaction, because part of the thing about the hate crime thing is it's heavily dependent on someone speaking to another person. If you don't talk to somebody, or like if somebody's trying to, have an interaction with you and you don't talk to them, um, that's where the state has to prove perceived your perception. But if you don't say anything, it's difficult to say, oh, he looked at me funny. Well, okay, that's not going to win over a jury in a court. They're going to be reliant on people opening their mouths and talking. And
Yeah.
that's and so when people don't talk, you can't use what they don't say against them. Maybe you can in a social setting, but not in a court of law. So
Do you think that silencing people is the end goal?
I think, yeah, if you control what people say or don't say, you can also control what they think. So if people don't ever talk about stuff, this is where, I mean, if you think about it, our we discuss ideas and formulate what we think by talking about with other people. And if you can control what people are allowed to say, you can control what they think. And that's where I also have a huge problem with government officials saying, and I've seen this with my coworkers, where they're asking questions of people in government and they're being corrected on the words that they use. And we're not talking about profanity. We're talking about that's not the term we use. Well, you're the government. It's not your job to tell me what proper terms
Right.
are. That not your place. You don't get to decide what the official, the dictionary wasn't written by the government. Right. And they don't get to go change the dictionary.
Right.
We have legal definitions, but they're not the definitions of what we use. And I think what we're also seeing is a fight over the fight between the word and the meaning and the idea, and people wanting to cause people to think that because they use this word, they want them to think of this when they're actually referring to something else. And that's where it's ironic that this is people who call things what they are can be labeled extremists by the government, because they, I've said this in other podcasts I've done on this topic. I think there's a kind of ongoing joke that George Orwell wrote 1984 as a warning, not as a handbook or an
Right.
instruction. But I mean, the reason why his stuff is being used by government is because he was very prophetic and understanding how rhetoric and language and mind control and thought control and being able to engage in, double speak or newspeak and all this kind of stuff allows you to control people, and not through violence necessarily. You control them by controlling what they think. So yeah, I see that definitely, where people don't want to say anything because they're afraid that they're going to get reported, and that things it's almost like, for example, I've always had a huge problem with the idea that employers can fire you for engaging in protected speech. Like, there's people who've lost jobs because they're part of certain movements. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Can we fire people from going to church, to the wrong church? And people will say, well, that's a protected class. Well, why is that form of speech protected legally, but this isn't? It actually goes back to, what's interesting is that hate crime bill. There was one state lawmaker who asked, if someone came onto my property, trespassed, and burned the American flag I have displayed out there, would it be a hate crime? And the sponsor of the bill amazingly said, no, it wouldn't. I mean, I find that fascinating. Like, that's not a hate crime. But if somebody were to go, they're doing the whole pride rainbow thing on sidewalks, and if somebody happens to break on it too hard, they can get charged with a hate crime. So
Yeah, I think she called it, she said it would be like trespassing, but you'd have to check with your insurance company. It was something, she had some really weird response.
it goes back to the point of that I was saying, is that their problem is that they want a definition that and they can't say this explicitly, but they want it's a hate crime when it's done against their stuff, but it's not
Yes.
a hate crime when it's done against stuff that they don't care about. And it's the whole point of the First Amendment is to treat all speech the same, as long as it's not, like they talk about hate speech. We don't have a First Amendment so that we can talk about the weather. We have the First Amendment so that we can talk about very controversial, very extreme ideas without threats of being arrested and persecuted by the state, right?
Right.
So when this categorizing of speech and behavior and actions based on whether or not it affects your personal ideology is the complete antithesis of the whole idea of what our form of government is about. It's about where you can kind of say whatever you want, for the most part, as long as you're not explicitly calling for violence. You can go out and say, I believe that this should be enacted into law, or I believe this. You can even say that you believe the First Amendment should be abolished, and that's protected speech under the First Amendment. I mean,
Yeah.
so yeah.
So I'm curious, how do you see, because we've been kind of talking a little bit about the hate crime hotline bill as well. And so both of these, for people that don't know, the hate crimes hotline is a task force within the Attorney General's office, and the domestic extremism is another task force
Right.
in the Attorney General's office. How do you see these working? Do you see them working together?
I think it's disconcerting that it's through the Attorney General's office, because they're claiming it's a public health issue, and yet the Attorney General's office is not the Department of Health. It's
Right.
it's the state's prosecutor. So the state can prosecute from that office, and they're talking about political extremism. So that's like, why is the Attorney General's office running a task force that's looking at something from a public health perspective? Like that, why is the state's prosecutor looking at an issue that could involve protected speech, or have constitutional issues? That's
Yeah.
where people should be raising questions like, why is this being done through the Attorney General's office? This is the guy who sues people and prosecutes people. He's not they're not in charge of dealing with public health crises. So
Yeah, I think that that is a huge concern. I mean, I think you probably remember with this AI, there's kind of switching gears just a little bit here. There's an AI task force under the Attorney General's office. And, I think there are maybe uses for legislation around AI and exploring that, but putting things like that under the Attorney General's umbrella, there are a lot of concerns when you start putting things under the state, the top law dog in the state. That raises some concerns, and especially in a state like Washington, where you have a very radical left Attorney General, and I would say Nick Brown is right up there with Ferguson. I think that's very, very concerning, and you
yeah,
know
I see the issue is, and I've toyed with AI quite a bit by just talking to it, and there's a couple AIs that I've had good conversations with. AI, the danger for people who hold beliefs that are dependent on people not challenging it, not because it's um, true, but because they're afraid of retaliation. Well, you can go to AI and ask it questions, and it doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't have unless it's programmed to. If it's just designed to be an ethical, like the one I use, Otter AI, and they don't have an agenda. They don't have biases. They don't suffer from envy, jealousy. They're not pushing any belief, and they're not trying to gain power. At least not yet. We'll see if Skynet pops out. But so that means that someone can go to an AI and ask it questions, and that or make points. For example, I point out to Otter AI that how can Washington State's capital gains excise tax be an excise tax if you don't have to pay if you don't have to pay it if the sale doesn't generate income? And it says that is a very good point. That's literally what the AI said. So like you can talk to the AI and it's going to give you answers. So this is where I could see there being. I mean, here's the issue. One of the issues that should be questions that should be raised. What exactly can they do? Because this is the internet. This is online. Are they going to? How can they regulate AI when I can just go to Otter and it's not based in Washington State? Are they going to try to make it illegal for? Are they going to require them to have it designed a certain way? Because we're already seeing that with certain AI where they are having to modify it so it doesn't give accurate responses to certain questions that you're not allowed to ask.
Right.
You don't ask because it's politically incorrect to even discuss these things. So that's where I definitely see that being an issue. And again, why is the attorney? I mean, I could see there being where AI can be used maliciously to like create false videos, create false images, and like okay, to be fair, I can see it where there's issues of defamation, slander, something where somebody's reputation is destroyed through falsehood, like somebody providing false of somebody being somewhere doing stuff that it shows a photo of somebody smoking a joint of marijuana, or generates a photo of somebody being at a political rally that they were at. I mean, and then their employer fires them over that. I mean, I could see that where that could be an issue where where it is illegal to do that, and they will prosecute you if you do. But yeah, I think President Trump did an executive order or some sort of policy where he's, or maybe it's part of that new bill that they're trying to pass.
It's part of the big beautiful bill.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But I haven't really been following that one as much, but AI has been fascinating so far.
Yeah. Funny story on that topic real quick. I had Grok AI make me a picture for Trump's birthday it's a picture of Trump blowing out candles on a birthday cake. And I posted it on the Conservative Ladies of America social media. And so many people were like commenting, Trump, you look so good. Oh, Trump, what kind of cake are you having? And I'm like, it's not real.
Yeah. I mean, AI is going to be, that's a whole other animal, but AI is going to be fascinating in how people who detach from reality for their own purposes and agendas are going to be challenged with AI, allowing people to also detach from reality for their own purposes, and how they're not going to be able to stand up to it because they themselves, people I've learned cannot push back against things that they themselves do in their own way. So that's where AI can allow people to engage in their own delusional world, and that's almost what we're seeing. That's kind of what we're almost seeing as a collective society, is people being allowed to detach from reality as long as it doesn't threaten other people's delusions. So
totally. This has been a fascinating conversation. My conversations with you usually are fascinating, and I love that you go down the rabbit hole and kind of come up with similar types of questions to things that I do. I always want to know, where does this lead? What's the next thing? What's this connected to? And it's all connected to something else somehow. And in Washington, it's usually, well, I'll say in all government, it's usually not a great, not necessarily a great place. What, in closing, what do you think? And I'll have a link to the Washington Attorney General's report on the Domestic Extremism Task Force. What are the next steps? Do you know, are they, with this report, does this go to the legislators, or what happens next?
Their actual report. So this is a preliminary report. Their next report, the final one, is due to the legislature by December 2026. So they've got some time to figure stuff out. But I mean, they could put out recommendations to the legislature, or there could be subsequent follow-up legislation that gives them more leg room, gives them more, expands the scope of their work. That might be what happens, or gives them authority in other areas. So it's they limited the scope of what they're allowed to do and what they're allowed to, like their authority and their power. But we could see that change. And honestly, if there's any kind of I'd say incidents or any kind of um, political incident in the state, I could see them saying, "Well, we need to do this. This is necessary," and that could be connected to the enforcement of immigration laws
Mhm.
or something like that. Like we had the No Kings rally, we had the that church that was in Seattle being attacked by Antifa. So any of these things could justify, on the surface, a lawmaker calling for more action. So
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. I think we will see that. One of the things I wanted to ask you about real quick before we finish here is when I watch this, like I said, it's like a therapy session, and you have that really highly paid gal, Cynthia Miller Idris from Peril, that comes and usually delivers some kind of a speech for training or whatever for about an hour of the
yeah.
meeting. Um, do you think, from what I've observed in the task force meetings, these members don't seem to be doing anything that would substantiate any kind of a report? So, my theory is that this report is all done within the AG's office. It's not actually done by the task force, just because I haven't seen them doing work that would formulate a report. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we could ask the members, but per task force rules, they're not allowed to talk to the media.
Right.
Which okay, it's like, okay, guys, I not allowing them to talk to the media on their own about the task force, that raises a lot of questions about, okay, why not? What if one of the task members says, "I don't agree with what's going on here," or "I don't like what's going on"? I mean, and then they'll obviously kick them out if they say anything. I'm guessing they're going to vote to remove them,
Sure.
but it's basically putting a gag order on them. So I would argue that the fact that they're not allowed to talk to the media on their own really tells you that if the attorney general's office is doing this all on their own, where this would be a way to prevent anybody from knowing about it.
Hmm.
So I think the fact that it's attorneys doing this, it means that they're going to know the law, and I think that that's part of the issue is they're going to have to figure out a way to navigate the constitutional and legal issues of labeling protected speech as domestic violent extremism as a government entity. I think that that's where they're probably looking at that issue right now. But as far as the task force members, yeah, if they're saying it's just we're just sitting around and having you know a group talk, they can't tell us. And it
Right.
really is this question of like, well, this is a government, like this is all being used. I think the thing that this is a big takeaway for a lot of people in Washington State. Your tax dollars could be used or are being used right now to oppose your own protected speech and ideology or
Mhm.
values or whatever it is. That's what your tax dollars may be being used to do right now, which is I can see why someone would have a huge problem with that. Saying, I'm not giving you my tax dollars so that you can figure out ways to oppose what I believe. That's not the role of government.
Well, I said that, and I took my tax dollars and marched them all the way down here to Florida.
Right.
I appreciate you taking the time today to chat with me about this, and you always have you and I kind of follow similar tracks on different issues. So hopefully you'll come back and we can do this again. Um, and I know you'll be following the task force, so maybe the next time we get another report or some kind of legislation, we can come back and geek out about it.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be interesting to see how much of what we've discussed actually links up with what they're doing.
I hope that you enjoyed our conversation. Would love to hear what your thoughts are on all of this. Please do leave us a comment, and please be sure to share this video with your freedom-loving friends, especially the ones who still live in the separate country of Washington. If you are not already, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel and to our Substack, which is the best way to get breaking alerts and calls to action. Thank you so much for watching today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.